Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm going to be talking about vehicle scrappage programs where India is dealing with a vehicle scrappage policy. Ours is a shorter term program, or was, but it led to a lot of very positive things, and that's what I kind of want to walk through. Um, just as way of background, as Hayden said, we're a national association of auto recyclers. I have 7 provincial regional associations, and they represent 350 direct members. So those are actual working auto recyclers buying end-of-life vehicles, selling parts and materials in virtually all corners of populated Canada. And we were organized in 1997, so not as long as ARA, our colleagues to the south, but in it for a while. And all of our members are audited to the Canadian Auto Recyclers Environmental Code, or CARIC. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because it was one of the things that fell out of our vehicle scrappage initiative. And that auditing by a third party is what defines us as being different than the other 1,000 or so auto recyclers, auto wreckers, scrap yards, junk yards that do exist in Canada. In terms of an industry overview, there are about 1.6 million end-of-life vehicles per year generated in Canada. That is an interpreted number because we don't have a great end-of-life certificate of destruction system to actually count. But year over year, it's that 5 to 6% of the fleet is retired. As with the USA, a very vibrant parts reuse marketplace exists and a material recovery sector. So that's primarily what my members are about, is reusing parts first, and those materials that are left on the hulk or the specialty materials are of value and add to the bottom line, but they are highly integrated with the supply chain on making sure that those vehicles are processed properly. The legislation and licensing that does exist in the industry tends to be provincial, so it's regional, not on a national basis. There are very few actual national requirements or policies, something that we're trying to change. So the vehicle itself is registered at a provincial level, and all of the major environmental rules exist at that provincial level. And that's why we have set up these provincial associations to kind of deal with those local issues. So I run the Ontario Association, which is the largest province in Canada, about 45% of the population, and tends to be the largest and most progressive of the auto recyclers. Traditionally, those provinces have had what we would call a historical salvage license, many of them coming from the 1970s, and they tended to be more with where are you situated in the city or the region from a zoning perspective, and somewhat minimal standards or enforcement against the environmental rules that do exist and are applied against all businesses. But much has changed since that Canada's National Scrappage Program. And I'll get into the whys and the hows, but we're certainly not where we need to be to have a fully functioning circular economy market going on. So to the National Vehicle Scrappage Program, it was launched in 2008 and ended in 2011. So it was a 3-year window that the government essentially intervened in the marketplace to drive some positive changes. It was introduced as an emissions reduction program, not as a stimulus program, not as a circular economy. So it was targeting 1995 or older vehicles. So again, we have to go back to 2008. And so those were roughly 13-year-old vehicles and older. And it was the 1995 vehicles that had the different emissions technology on them. And so that's what they were targeting. They offered a $300 cash incentive. And if I did my math right, I think that's 18,000 Indian rupees. So not a lot of money. At that time, the $300 was worth more than what your average scrap car coming off the road was, but it wasn't a dramatic amount. The automakers themselves added on their own incentive, roughly $500 to $1,000. If you went in and bought a new vehicle, then you got the $300 incentive from the government, but they topped it up with more money to try and drive people to purchase their vehicles. And if you note the dates, 2008, the great global financial crisis that happened, and how the auto sales dropped off. So they tacked on to the emissions program, and we're really starting to drive people getting in the door and buying new vehicles. Excuse me, new vehicles. The program itself, they had allocated $93 million Canadian to run the program. They ended up only spending about 75 of that, and not all of it was for the cash incentive. And I should add that they also offered transit passes, bike incentives, different things that weren't straight cash oriented to try and help you buy a new vehicle. So they were really interested in active transportation. All told, they retired about 120,000 vehicles over that 3-year period. So again, in relation to that 1.6 million vehicles coming off the road every year, it wasn't a huge dramatic insertion into the industry. The government engaged an environmental organization called the Clean Air Foundation to kind of manage this on a national basis, and they ended up branding the program as Retired Your Ride, which is a play on a very popular auto detailing show called, I think it was Pump Your Ride, but very involved consumer education engagement. So the graphic up there is a sample of the website that they ran. So not only did they have to promote the program, but there was a huge amount of interaction with our industry on what happens to your car once it enters the system. What's the responsible thing to do? And that was sort of our ability to also engage with a lot of different people. But ultimately, they had ad campaigns, contests, a lot of social media activity, just a lot of different consumer-oriented activity to try and promote the program. And we got pulled along in that as the program evolved. As I said, part of that education engagement was about auto recycling. To the federal government's credit, they knew that by intervening in the marketplace, they were going to be disruptive. And they posed the question of why are we, if we intervene in the marketplace to reduce emissions, are we creating other problems that we need to deal with? And as they scanned the environment and looked at the legislative and regulatory oversight of our industry, they deemed that it wasn't up to the standards to make sure that every vehicle coming off the road through their program was managed properly. So they contracted us to develop the Canadian Auto Recyclers Environmental Code, CARIC. So this was a standards book, voluntary, because it only related to auto recyclers who are participating in Retire Your Ride. But what it did was it began to codify what their legislative requirements are across Canada, but also brought in a lot of best practices, housekeeping, things that the industry knew should happen in order to manage it properly. They provided funding to train all of the auto recyclers who wanted to be involved in Retire Ride to that code. And most importantly, they hired and trained third-party auditors who would visit every single auto recycler who was on the program and audit them against a protocol, a scoring system, if you will, that made sure that they were meeting the legislative requirements and then being graded on a percentage scale as to how well they were meeting the best practices, the housekeeping, the industry knowledge that we had created. And here's an example of the website, which still exists. And it has got the audit protocols, it's got videos that were used as part of the training process, a lot of explanation materials as to for an auto recycler to use, for consumers to better understand what modern auto recycling is all about. As we get near the end and I'm sort of out of my presentation mode, I'll make sure that I paste in to the chat box a series of resources that talks about Retire Ride. It provides the links to Carrick and some of the other items. So Carrick is still very much alive and working for us. And as I said up front, all of our members continue to be audited against Carrick. And it's what really defines who we are, how we're different. And so we've been 10 years now since the um, Retire Right ended, but it's still utilized by the association for what our members are about. So in terms of some of the legacies of the Retire Ride program, Carrick is front and center with that. And the government will even admit that, yeah, that was one of our best wins. Removing these vehicles, is good for short-term emissions, but ultimately they wanted to make sure that they were kind of leading the industry to where they needed to be. We still have the certified network of auto recyclers. Again, it's mainly the ARC members. You can be audited if you're not a member, and more um, other entities are looking at Carrick. So after Retire Ride ended, we ended up on 3 separate occasions working directly with the manufacturers, both Ford and GM, for dealer incentive programs. So GM ran a cash for clunkers program, which we processed all of their vehicles. Ford ran a recycle your ride program on a number of occasions, and we processed all of their vehicles. And we even generated contracts with a couple of the other OEMs on some of their vehicle take back programs or recall programs. They looked at Carrick and said, yes, this is what we need to make sure that all of those vehicles are managed responsibly. Since Retire Ride, 6 of the provinces, and there are 10 out there in Canada, have updated their regulations for what auto recycling should be. And basically encoding a lot of what Carrick is into regulations and legislation. Many of the provinces could not use Carrick directly because it hasn't gone through a process like the Canadian Standards Association, but it is directional, and it approved that little recyclers in remote locations could meet Carrick, run a better business, and be compliant with the rules. One of our provinces has actually identified Carrick specifically. They already had an auto recycling license, and they adopted Carrick as the standard in order to obtain, and now this year to maintain that actual physical license enforced by the province. At the end of Retire Right, ARC inherited all of the assets of the program. So we are now the owners of Carrick and responsible for updating it and deploying it. We inherited all of the branding, the database that ran the system, the network, the URLs, everything that Retire Ride was all about. And we continue to operate Retire Ride and its sister vehicle donation program called Car Heaven on a national basis. So they operate as tangible things that we can interact with the public because it's branded, it's got good awareness. And more than one person has said, this Retire Ride is great. Finally they're recycling vehicles properly. And we always tell them, we've been recycling vehicles for 100 years now in Canada. This is just something that you can latch onto and understand better. One of the things that, so as I talked about, this was a program as opposed to a policy. And Canada really does not have an end-of-life vehicle policy as to how it wants to handle things. But at the end of Retire Ride, we worked with the Clean Air Foundation, now called Summerhill Impact. and the government of Canada. And we ran a 2-day innovative forum on the future of auto recycling in Canada. The manufacturers were represented. We had delegates from Japan, from the Netherlands, from the USA. Really, the complete supply chain was there to talk about what are the gaps, what are the opportunities, and that led to things like a white paper on auto recycling, which we were able to deploy, and that's what started this whole process of how do we um, take all the good things that came out of that program and make sure that every vehicle is handled in that fashion. And that led to provinces, territories, the federal government sort of recognizing the auto recycling sector. And because we were part and parcel, we as the association were part and parcel of the development, deployment, and wrap up, we got pulled along very well. So uh, making sure that we kind of brought all those stakeholders together was really important to making sure that it lived on. So some lessons learned. Certainly, excuse me, this is Retire Ride was an opportunity for the industry to coalesce around the issue. Up until then, because there weren't a lot of federal activities, the industry kind of operated somewhat independently. But because they saw money coming in, they saw programs coming in, they really rallied around and said, let's, make sure that we grab this, we benefit as much as possible. The second was the professionalization of the industry. So again, having standards, even if they're just ours, but having them audited third party, it's really easy to point to that from a government perspective, from a media perspective, from a local community engagement. This is what we are, this is what we represent. We want everyone to operate to that level. A lot of members looked at the Carrick and said, why should I adopt this? I've been doing this for 50 years. Why doesn't the guy down the street do this? But we convinced them that you need to show leadership. You need to do this and show that this can be done and done profitably. And virtually to a T, all of our members who went through Carrick and who continue to go through it comment that they wish they had done this 20 years ago, because ultimately it's about running a clean, crisp, organized, systematic approach to auto recycling. So all of them are more profitable, they're cleaner, safer, they have better insurance. So insurance companies now recognize Carrick and offer better insurance. So it is really been the driving force in professionalizing the industry. It certainly allowed us more interaction with the OEMs. So we meet regularly. I'm meeting with them next week to talk about stewardship of electric vehicle batteries. And we've had hundreds and hundreds of meetings and interactions, educating the OEMs on what we do, what our problems are, how the things that they do impact us. And they're infinitely more bigger than us. They're more professional than us, but they understand that we need to be healthy for their business to be healthy, because we do not have direct EPR, extended producer responsibility, for vehicles in Canada. But we do have a managed system, and we're trying to figure out, what's the best way for us to be healthy and for them to be healthy, and stakeholder to everything related to ELV. So we've raised our profile such that when the government or anybody is looking at, what's going on in the end of life vehicle, whether it's selling parts, buying cars, processing the vehicles, they're turning to us, and we're having input into those dialogues. And again, electrification, is one of the biggest interactions. It's going to dramatically change the industry. People who are selling EVs, people who want to recycle the batteries, they're finally understanding that those batteries, those components need to be removed from the vehicle before crushing and shredding. And that's the best way to obtain those resources before they're lost, and just good for the overall economy. Other lessons learned, and I said this up front about how Environment Canada approached this, is don't solve one problem like emissions or greenhouse gas reductions and create another problem like abandoned vehicles or improper dismantling and pollution. So it draws some lines in the sand and creates a legal framework and earlier discussion about the formal and informal markets in India, in Canada. It is we want it to be black and white because we have laws, we have rules, and that provides a business who's or individual who's operating illegally in the marketplace at least a path forward and understanding what the requirements are in order to be part of the regulated community. But we are still kind of tightening the noose on allowing those to operate. And ultimately, we want the balance of removing vehicles from the road and the industry's need to actually survive. So those older vehicles are a source of parts. They're a source of for us to sell to kind of keep them on the road. Um, and so where there is discussion about scrappage, our position is that they need to have modest financial incentives. Throwing $5,000 on an old scrap car is going to completely disrupt the industry. We're not a fan of any limit on part restrictions. You can't sell the engine or you can't sell any items off of this vehicle. It really guts the existing industry. And ultimately, our final goal is to encourage proper ELV recycling for all vehicles. So don't just focus on vehicles that go through a program. Make sure that you're looking at and measuring all of the vehicles that are coming off the road. There's 1.6 million, and Carrick has shown that a legitimate business doing the basics can run a better business and protect the environment and participate in the overall economy of making sure all those vehicles are handled properly. So that's the end of my formal presentation. I'm going to escape out of here, and hopefully I don't disrupt too much, and kind of welcome Hayden back to the conversation.
Thanks very much, Steve, for you. I'll leave you. Yes, marvelous. There you are. Well done, Steve. Thank you so much for that. Very informative. You talked about the pros and cons, and I'll be making some notes. And I might put you on the spot here, so I do apologise. But you've had the scrappage scheme. You've looked at it. India's about to enter one. What's your message to India? What would you say to them? What to look out for? What to do properly? Or
well, it's and I think Tom yesterday talked about this about standards. Really, what it's all about. So standards kind of work two ways. They help the government and help other stakeholders of the process understand how a vehicle is processed and done properly, so that there's no ugly leakage in the system. But from the industry's perspective, standards are welcome in that they do provide a blueprint for where your business needs to be. And the more you codify the standards in regulations in the law, the harder it is to kind of adapt to the new environment. So that's where we think a code that is referenced, recognized by other people, and ultimately to have standards. We were consulted as an industry, and we could bring real world issues to what was going on. And that's the challenge, I think, for India right now, is that it doesn't seem to have a formalized sector that can talk as one voice or as a group of voices. And the government, other people will want to talk to the most definitive voice that they can. And if the informal sector has no mechanism to provide their input, governments will tend to just go to someone who will respond to them. So they may go to the manufacturers because they know where they are, they know who they are, and say, okay, you and I need to figure out some standards. And the OEMs, won't have a clue. They'll know what they want, but ultimately, our mantra kept being, we need to be at the table. We need to be holding the pen in writing the rules for our own industry, because nobody knows it better than us. So how you coalesce so that you have a strong enough voice from industry to have input into those standards, into that regulated environment. That will be a challenge.
And
And
just, oh, sorry,
and
please.
and there are, and that's partly what Sandy's message was yesterday. Um, I think it was yesterday. Kind of
As
losing track of the days
Tuesday,
now. Tuesday. Oh well.
Tuesday.
Um, there is a global community of auto recyclers. So IGERA in Europe. We run the International Roundtable on Auto Recycling to bring together the different industry associations to learn from one another. And yes, that group only meets every 18 months, every 2 years. But I can pick up the phone and talk to Japan. I can ask questions and learn from one another. So the Malaysian group was very good at that. Had some very draconian rules coming in, and they reached out to the global community and said, "Help!" And we all, supplied their support, supplied the information. Where the IRT has had Indian representation, it's been through the Society of Indian Automotive Manufacturers, and a personal initiative from Captain Ram. But who's that next group? Because he's retired. Who's going to step forth and be the voice of the Indian auto recycling industry will be something that will be welcomed by the global community.
Thanks. And please, anyone, please ask any questions that you have for Steve on the Q&A section. One of the rock yes. But just another point, in that last reply, you sort of mentioned that, and in your speech, you talked about working together, bringing the stakeholders together, sort of having unity to understand the challenges that everyone's facing, to understand this. How easy is it to do that? I know you're very dedicated and you're doing that, but how easy to do that, or how do you get the attention for this to happen?
Yeah, and part of the success that we've had has been coalition building. It has been, we're the small voice in this whole thing. We're the back end of it all. That is the most misunderstood part of that sector. So we very slowly started to make friends with the manufacturers and their associations. So we have the CAA, the Canadian Automotive Auto Association. So they represent drivers, and just sort of we have expertise in our area, and we would just keep reaching out to environmental groups to educate them on what we're all about. Insurance, just to educate them on what role we can play. So again, when we didn't have the kind of standards, it was just sort of hey, you should talk to us. We're really good guys. But that morphed into we're the professional certified network of auto recyclers that can handle your issues and handle your information. So it was, I always joke, we were an overnight sensation 10 years in the making. And it was just that slow process of being out there, having a presence, having some, marketing and communication skills to it all. But just point to these other stakeholders, what role you played. You have to believe in what you do in society, and then you just go out and evangelize on it, and again, do it from, it's not me talking, it's not one business talking, it's the entire sector talking about it all.
Great. And sorry, we will come to questions, I promise, but you mentioned in Canada it's all on provinces, and some provinces are a bit more advanced than others. Is there a sort of sometimes, and I don't know if it's good or bad to be honest, but some provinces just wait for others to go first? Do you go first and we will follow, or is that an issue?
That's how Canada operates.
Right.
It's like whoever's got the biggest problem or opportunity sort of moves. And then there are a lot of mechanisms within Canada for cross-provincial education. So, ARC has been sort of set up the same way. Our original mandate, and still today, is just, what's going on in this province that this province needs to know about, from a good thing or a bad thing. And it tended to, we British Columbia is our most Western based, and very much like California in the US. So an early adopter of progress and environmentalism. So a lot of very innovative things happen there, and it's my job to take those innovations and drive them elsewhere. Quebec It is a distinct culture in that it has its French as the primary language, a very European type feel to the place. And so they approach things somewhat differently. But again, we're allowed to kind of take those successes and broadcast them out. And that's essentially what Carrick was BC had some ideas and some rules. We all looked at it and said, hey, that's great. How do we do that elsewhere? And wrote it and then just sort of talk like, well, this is the most natural thing ever. So
Mm.
there is interprovincial cooperation, and at the end of it all there is interprovincial shaming of, hey, Saskatchewan, why have you not done anything there? And that kind of gets them reluctantly kind of moving on things.
Okay, and let's just move on to some of the questions. This is from Vialapan again. How about Canada's experience in segregation, domestic personal use, and industrial on the basis of on-road utilisation and maintenance to arrive at the optimal end of life suitable for recycling?
The word, optimization is happens every single day at the vehicle level, if you will. It is such a competitive industry. There are thought to be about 1,500 to 2,000 sort of legitimate auto recyclers, and all of them kind of carve out a niche that they are trying to develop some expertise. Maybe it's just local, but maybe it's heavy trucks, maybe it's buses, maybe it's fleet management. And so we find that there's a lot of business just through the pressures of the marketplace try to figure out what's the best thing for them. And I'm in the position where just trying to oversee sort of who's doing what and find those successes even at the local level. So when somebody calls me from another province, like, hey, I really want to get into, servicing dealers only. How do I do that? And hopefully I'll be able to go, well, yeah, this guy over here, he's done a great job. Let me connect you to so that you can talk to it all. But because there's no kind of overriding um, policy or sort of body that we can interact with, we literally just create our own. So we created an entity called the End of Life Vehicle Industry Sector Council to handle R&D, education, training. It doesn't do anything. It acts as a vessel for, oh, we really like that training there in a different part of the automotive supply chain. Maybe it's on the repair side. How can we adapt that into something on the auto recycling side? So we tend not to have people kind of specializing in, like, I'll say, fleet, or sort of business versus the personal side of things. It just depends on the business model that you want to run at the local level.